Hello, Northlanders. It's Dan Williamson. It's now Season 2 for Archive Dive, as this past week, the Superior Telegram released its 13th episode of the monthly history podcast, which is hosted by Telegram reporter Maria Lockwood. Each month, Maria and a local historian will dive into the archives of historic events, people, and places in Superior and Douglas County. This month, we take a peek inside of one of Superior's grandest buildings, the Grand Opera House. Buildings designed by Carl Wirth anchored downtown Superior in the late 1800s. His most elaborate design was the Grand Opera House on Belknap Street. The lavish theater opened in 1890 and entertained Superior residents for years before it was destroyed by fire. For this episode of Archive Dive, Maria is once again joined by local historian and retired librarian Teddie Meronek as they discuss the history of the Opera House and its next-door neighbor, the New Jersey Block. Also designed by Wirth, the New Jersey Block is now known as the Globe News Building. Here is a clip from the episode.
As I've said, if there's a building that I could rebuild in Superior, it would be the Grand Opera House.
Why? What was it that set it apart?
Well, it was so exotic because it was of Moorish design, so it had all kinds of fancy exterior decorations and stained glass and looked like an opera house in a big city. I think I'd mentioned earlier that Carl Wirth, who's the artist who painted the murals at the Superior Public Library, in an interview he did for the newspaper, he said if Superior could rebuild the opera house, he was very fond of that painting. He said if Superior could rebuild that opera house, people from around the state would be coming to Superior just to see it.
Because it was just such a beautiful building.
It was a beautiful building and very unique.
Also in the episode, Maria and Teddie will chat about some of the events that the Grand Opera House hosted, which former presidents spoke there, the multiple fires, the dismay over a loss of a valuable piece of equipment, the role then Superior Telegram owner John T. Murphy had with the Opera House, the early days of the New Jersey Block, the mystery of when Globe News officially became Globe News, and much more. You can find that episode at superiortelegram.com or wherever you also get this podcast. I'll also put a link in the show notes. In case you missed Archive Dive's 12th episode, I'm resharing it here. January marked 1 year since a 2022 fire destroyed 2 century-old buildings in Superior. Maria and Teddie dive into the history of both buildings. I encourage you to take a listen, and when you're done, click the link in our show notes to find more episodes of Archive Dive.
Hello, and welcome to Archive Dive. I'm Maria Lockwood, a reporter with the Superior Telegram. Each month, we dip into files on historic events, people, and places in Superior and Douglas counties with local historians. Fire destroyed 2 storied Superior warehouses on one bitterly cold day, January 6, 2022. No one was injured, but Superior Mayor Jim Payne called it a terrible tragedy for the city, a loss of both the historic buildings and their potential futures. Today, we dip into the past to learn more about the Osborne Warehouse and the Toohey Mercantile Building, also known as the Bayside Warehouse. Helping us dive into the story today is local historian Teddie Meronek. Hello, Teddie.
Hi, Maria.
Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, we have 2 very old warehouses.
We do.
And which one is older?
Well, the Osborne, which we would know now as the Sievertson Building, was the first one to be built. And the interesting thing I found in my research about this building is that it wasn't financed by the man whose name was on the building, Mr. Osborne. It was financed by the Land and River Improvement Company. That was the organization that built, in fact, downtown Superior. And some of their buildings still stand. Globe News, the Empire Block. I mean, they were all financed by the company. So the people who were going to use this warehouse as a grocery wholesale center didn't actually put up the money for the building.
Okay, but they put their name, that person's name on it.
They put their name on it, and I'm sure there must have been some sort of contract with the Land and River Improvement Company for rental of it, our leasing of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it was going to be a fantastic building, 4 stories with a full basement, and it was going to be used as a wholesale dealership. And there was a board of directors, and when I looked into their names, I found out that most of them were real estate men and lawyers. I didn't see a grocer among them. I don't think there was a long history of the grocery business in this company, but the building was very, very beautiful. It had a couple fireplaces, and the first floor was beautiful for a warehouse, but those were the offices were on the first floor. And they also had, a couple huge safes. But the most interesting thing I found was that they were built according to the way that grain mills and just mill buildings were constructed, which meant that they were built with huge pieces of timber. And they did this for fire prevention, because the bigger the piece of timber, the slower it burned.
Right.
And so if you construct it in that way, you can get a lower insurance rate. Well, that didn't work out in the end, but they did.
No.
They were over 100 years old. So the Land and River Improvement Company started building this in 1892, in the fall of 1892, and they were scheduled to open the following year. It was going to cost about $70,000 to build it.
That's a lot back then.
That's a lot. So they start in October, gets towards May, the building's done. The company apparently had some internal problems, some disagreement among the shareholders or the board of directors, and they delayed the opening while they settled these internal problems. A month later, they had disbanded.
So that left the building with no owners?
That left the building with no business.
With no business. So it was empty.
It was empty. They'd moved some stock in there, but they sold it all when they decided to disband. So the main problem that was happening at that time is that in about May of 1893, I think, or maybe a little earlier, there was a financial panic across the United States, a depression. And it was started by railroads, a couple railroads going, having financial problems, going out of business, hit the stock market, hit the financial centers in New York. And so it just spread across the United States. And Superior was at that time at the peak of their building and what was going on. And everything slowed down or stopped.
Okay.
So, and in fact, there was going to be another grocer who was building a warehouse in the same vicinity as the Osborne, and they had hoped to have it open in 1893, but they postponed it because of what was going on in the financial world.
Okay, so it wasn't the lack of grocery expertise; it was just the financial times.
It was the financial times, and I look at this and I look at what Superior was in 1893. I truly believe if that financial panic hadn't hit, that we would have been the Chicago of the North. We really would have. I mean, everything was right on cue for that. The railroads, were going great guns. The elevators, everything. It was just flourishing, and then it came to a halt. And Superior was really built on people or investors from the East who didn't live here, but who pulled their money out or lost it during the panic.
Oh, and that warehouse itself would have been positioned real well because it's right on the
on the
waterfront.
Yes,
right
and we
rail
were
line.
in a much better state than, as they called them, the cliff dwellers in Duluth.
Cliff dwellers?
Yes, we were going to corner the market on grocery wholesalers. But I read a quote once from President Franklin Roosevelt, because his father had invested heavily in Superior, including the steel mill, and of course they built Roosevelt Terrace. President Roosevelt once said that his father lost his shirt.
In Superior?
Yes, because of the panic. I don't think they were broke, but...
Okay, so we have the Osborne building. It's been built. It was a grocer wholesale for a brief time.
Not even. They
Not
had
even?
some stock in there, but
Not really.
they didn't really, seek any customers for it because they were having so much trouble.
What happened? You've got this giant building. Where do you go from here?
Well, luckily, the Land and River Improvement Company stepped in, and Mr. Wymus was the president of the company at that time, and he found somebody to come in there, which turned out to be the Bemis Bag Company, and they actually bought the building. And I can't remember if they paid $55,000 or $57,000 for it.
So bought it at a loss.
Yeah, for what the improvement company had put into it, surely. But they came in and they made bags for everything from cement to flour.
Oh,
And so
paper bags?
these were cloth bags
cloth
at the
bags?
beginning, and they set up all their machinery. They were a company that had factories in several cities
Okay.
in the United States. So they set it all up, and they employed about 100 people, including many, they called them girls, but women in the business. So a woman could go there and get a job making
Wow.
bags.
That's pretty progressive.
Yeah. And eventually, I guess the bags lost their favor and people went to paper products to put their goods in. But they retooled and manufactured those for a couple of years. But they also were having trouble within the company of, board trouble, board of directors trouble. So that was the end of that then.
When did they leave the building?
It was, I want to say in the teens, 19 teens, I think.
Okay.
So
Then what happened?
well, it goes through many, many different people who used it for what it was built as a warehouse.
Okay.
Lots of different companies. And I think they really didn't have a stable occupant until Sievertson's Fisheries came in the 70s. It just went through, people would stay for a year, couple years. I think there was somebody who used it in the 20s as a liquor store, storage unit, but then Prohibition happened. So, well, that was the end of that business. It was one unsuccessful thing until Sievertson's came in and opened their smelt business. That's what they started out with, was smelt.
Okay.
In that particular building, because of course they had their business in Duluth.
Right.
But they were on St. Louis Bay, and they were bringing in like 2 tons of smelt per day
Really?
in those days, in the 70s.
And they were able to process it all?
They were processing it, and then they were freezing it, and they shipped it across the country. They shipped it to restaurants. They also shipped it to mink farms because they fed it to the mink.
That makes sense.
And I guess people used smelt for bait too. That was part of their business.
So how long did it remain a smelting facility?
They were there, boy, I can't remember the date, but then the smelt eventually, the population dropped so dramatically. I think they went into other things after that. So, but
And
it was
retained
on,
the building?
yeah, it was on the market though when it burned down.
Right. That's the sad thing is Mayor Jim Payne alluded to that, didn't that, it was ready, it was turnkey, ready
Right.
for a business to come in or a company to come in and make something
Right.
of it again.
And I think what also damaged these buildings in a way is that we hadn't yet reached that point where people think warehouses are cool, Certainly Duluth had started that on Canal Park with all the old warehouse buildings, turning them into either retail outlets or their hotels or apartments. And, they were probably they were still occupied when that first started, but you just think, did we miss that opportunity? But I don't know what the regulations are about building things like that on the waterfront in Superior, along
Right,
Lake
the
Superior.
waterfront.
Minnesota probably has different regulations than we do. And of course, you're dealing with buildings that are sitting on a site that's probably contaminated in some way because of the elevators. What did they have to use to keep the rodent population down there? And what did they use?
Right.
Yeah, because it's a big industrial area. I mean, you've got the railroads, you've got the elevators, and you've got warehouses.
Right. It's kind of pigeonholed over there and you don't really see it. It's not in
Right.
the middle of everything where like a lot of the Duluth warehouses are.
Yeah, like I was telling you, I was only down there once. I didn't hang out at the waterfront a lot in my lifetime. But,
Right.
yeah, and, Canal Park was the absolute perfect place. As you said, there was a road that went all the way through it where you're not really finding that down there. But I'm sure they could have been turned into something fabulous, except for the fire.
Except for the fire.
Yeah.
So next door was another grocery warehouse.
Yes, the Tui. Yep.
Amen building?
Well, it started out just Mr. Tui, Mr.
Okay.
Edmund Tui, and that he had been in the grocery business. He already had a grocery outlet in Superior, but decided to build this building down there. And he wasn't backed by the Land and River Improvement Company. It was his investment.
Okay.
And he was going to go in the wholesale grocery business. And I thought it was kind of interesting. Within the warehouse, not only were they distributing groceries, but on the second floor, they had a cigar manufacturing business.
So they had a cigar manufacturing business?
Yes. Don't you always think of cigars and groceries going together? I don't know.
Not me, but they did. Was it the only cigar manufacturer
No.
in the town?
I think the city directory I looked at that year, they had 9 in Superior. But from the addresses, I could probably figure out that maybe some of them were in homes. That was how people were making their living, was by manufacturing. Even a small amount of cigars, I suppose, could give you some money.
Mm-hmm.
But theirs had to be the biggest.
Do you know how many they employed?
No. It was a surprise to me to find that out. I thought the warehouse was going to be all groceries, I didn't know the cigar business, there was that kind of money in cigar making,
Right.
but
Do you know how long the cigar business stayed there?
no, I don't.
It was just
This could be another podcast, Maria.
part of business as usual.
Yes.
At the Amen Mercantile.
Yeah. I suppose maybe if the, wholesale grocery business grew, that maybe they decided, well, it would be better to use that floor for groceries too. But I'd have to look into it in the city directories to see how long it did go on. The city directories are your best friend when you're looking for tips on what was going on in Superior in the 1890s and beyond.
Okay, I'll keep that in mind.
Yes.
And it sounds like this one would have been one of the larger cigar manufacturing businesses in Superior.
Yeah, so I'm
that
wondering
time.
how long I'll have to look into that sometime, how long they actually lasted, and did they wipe out everybody else because of their size? So, but and his business was successful. Of course, he didn't have any competition really,
No, the next
because
door
the
warehouse.
Osborns had just gone out of business, but he was very successful, and he actually then went into business, I think it was with Peter Amen. So it was the Toohey Amen company, and he had also had a background in grocery wholesale.
Okay.
So, they made a good coupling there. But I think Mr. Toohey sort of maybe he lost interest in the business. An interesting fact I found out about him, he was the first fire chief of Superior.
Really?
And his building burned down.
Well, a long time later.
Yes, I know. But I just thought, wow, that's amazing. Yeah, the first fire
First
chief.
fire chief, Toohey. What was his first name?
Edmund.
Edmund Toohey.
And he pulled out of the business.
Oh.
But the Amens kept his name. Didn't sound like it was any internal fighting or anything, that he had just decided that it was time for him to move.
Okay.
And he had married into the Smith family, one of the daughters of, I think it was Neil Smith. And then the Smith family was also connected to the Roth family. So they all sort of knew each other. And I believe Mr. Roth, TJ, sat on one of the boards of either the Toohey or Amen Company at one time,
Okay.
because their families were connected. But he left town then, and the Amen Company, keeping his name, they still did a great business. And in fact, they did such a booming business that eventually the warehouse wasn't big enough for them, and they went down to Winter Street, and they built a huge warehouse there.
Is that still standing?
Yes, it is. That's had an interesting history too. And the day they opened, they had 10,000 people visit
The new
the
building
new
on Winter.
warehouse.
Okay.
They gave out carnations to the ladies, and they had food samplings and all of that stuff.
Wow.
But it eventually turned into it was a cooperative wholesaler. Can't remember what the exact name of it was. And then eventually it turned into Gino's Pizza. And now it's a manufacturer. You know where it is. It's on Tower, between Banks and Tower.
Charter Next?
Yes.
Charter Next Films. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was, wasn't it?
The cooperatives, yes.
Cooperatives, yes.
Yes, the wholesale cooperative. Yes, that was there for many, many years.
For many, many years.
Yeah,
Okay, so
yeah.
that was built by Mr. Amen,
Yep.
who owned the Toohey Amen building.
Yep.
Okay.
And then just as Mr. Amen was building and opening this new building, Mr. Toohey came back to town.
Oh.
And he decided that he wanted his old warehouse back, and he was going to get into the grocery business again. And he had been both on the West Coast and the East Coast, and then came back to Superior. And I found an interesting entry in one of the city directories that linked his name in this business with a Pattison, Toohey Pattison. And I could never track down who the Pattison was. Was it Martin? Was it his son? And this was 1917. And Martin died in 1918.
Probably not Martin then.
I don't know. And Mr. Toohey died around that time too.
Oh.
So that was the end of his connection. But for a while, they did keep his name in the business, even though he was no longer affiliated with it.
So at that time, he had the Toohey warehouse, and the Amen had moved into the Winter Street completely?
Yep.
So when he died, did the Toohey building stop being a grocery warehouse at
that point? It did.
Point?
And I suppose they couldn't compete with the Amen business because it was so large. But I think it was another business that passed from hand to hand. Rookie Transfer. I don't know if Rookie Transfer was there, but a lot of, people who were storing things. But their biggest, after the Toohey business closed, the biggest business that went in there was Builder Supply. That was their warehouse for their hardware business.
Okay.
And they had it for years and years. They stayed there longer than anyone.
Even then the Tooheys and the Amens? So
they were there until the 80s.
Till the 80s.
Yeah.
So when was the building built?
That one opened in 1894.
1894. So that was past the kind of stock market, the depression.
They were
impacted
that financial panic lasted until about 1897, but apparently Superior rebounded. Maybe it didn't affect it quite as much as it did other places, but they had started to rebound. So he must have had all of his financing kind of figured out ahead of time because he was, as I said, he was originally going to start it in 93, and he only delayed it by a year when he built the building. And that was another really nice building with maple floors. And I mean, you read the descriptions of those buildings, and I would have loved to have seen them in their heyday, what they look like.
Was it also built with the large timbers?
Yes, it was,
fire?
because you could get a better insurance rate.
Right.
I don't know, wood's wood, isn't it? I don't know. And it was prominently mentioned in newspaper articles that it was fire safe. So they must have thought they were safe. They were. They really were. When you think about it, they were over 100 years old when they burnt down, 120 years old. So
right. And there's nothing left now of the Osborne building.
Nothing, yeah.
And there's still a facade left of the Toohey Amen.
I think the Toohey was designed by Oliver Traphagen, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe you're right.
Yeah. So another one of his buildings gone.
There are some still in the area, right?
In Duluth. But the most famous Superior building, well, it's really outside the Superior area. It's in the county, or it was in the county, I have to say. It's been gone a long time. And I think that one burned down too.
Oh, no.
That was Morton Fruin's cattle ranch.
Oh.
The Powder River cattle ranch that he had outside the city limits.
In the town of Superior?
I want to say,
Oakland or Parkland?
I can't remember it right now, but only Morton Fruin would have a building for cattle built and designed by Oliver Traphagen. So that kind of gives you the hint about that it really wasn't a successful business. Right. He spent all his money in the wrong places.
Okay. So it's neat to look back and realize that these buildings had so much life and so many different businesses come through their doors.
Yeah. But I was really hoping I was going to find something that was really, I was hoping for bootleggers at the very least.
Well, one
right
of them
on
had
the water.
alcohol.
They did, but it was legal. But I was just thinking it would have been the perfect place during Prohibition for people to store liquor, but they did all that out in Billings Park.
Oh, really?
Because they had access to the water there too, so you could bring it. Yeah, but it was really just a warehouse business.
And I did hear that the Toohey Amen building helped to coin the phrase "from rail to sail."
I did hear that too. I was kind of...
Because it was right there on the rail line. It was right there on the harbor. It just
That's why they decided to build it there, was because it was easy access, because, they weren't selling oranges out of the building, to people in Superior. They were shipping things all over the place. So
it became a big logistical hub for transportation.
Yeah, and it's funny when I think of that, and then Mr. Amen moves it down, closer to downtown. But I suppose it was near rails, but I don't know.
Well, it's too bad. There is still that facade. There's talk that maybe that will stay up, but
and you have to give a credit to the firefighters who fought that fire in those conditions during that time of the year.
Right, it was negative 10 degrees.
Yep.
With a brutal wind chill.
Yep, and you just got to give those people so much credit.
No one
for
was
doing
hurt.
that. No one was hurt. Amazing that they could do that. There was another big fire like that downtown Superior in probably the late 1950s, and there are pictures in the Telegram of just, it looked like waterfalls of ice coming off the building because all the water had frozen. So I can't imagine what it was like there with 2 buildings on fire and the amount of water they were trying to feed to that building. Yeah. So
Well, hats off
a
to them.
shout out to them. Yes.
Definitely. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to Archive Dive. New episodes are available monthly at superiortelegram.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you have a topic you'd like us to explore, email me at mlockwood@superiortelegram.com.
I know where to find you.